Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to look at Abraham Lincoln. And Chris, when people think about Abraham Lincoln and his physical appearance, I think there are probably three things that stand out: his height, his hat, and his beard. And today we're going to talk about the story behind Lincoln's beard. Because if you look at early pictures of Lincoln, he doesn't have any whiskers. But by the time he becomes president in 1861, he does. What's the story behind that, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating, true history you didn't know but should. And you think about it, we have these images in our minds, not just of presidents, but just of people. They look a particular way, and so when you start thinking about Abraham Lincoln without a beard, it's just really, really weird. And I've never been one that's been able to grow a beard, nor do I have any desire to grow a beard, but when I think about the reasoning behind Lincoln and growing a beard, first of all, it's just fascinating that this is a story that, at the beginning, many people said, oh, that's just fake news. There's not a real, but the great thing is that this story is actually archived. It's history. There's proof that this story or this event did take place. And what's fascinating is the president of the United States, the one who stopped the Civil War, the one who kept a fractured nation together, the one who, if had not been assassinated, probably would have done so much more for this nation. He decided to change his appearance, not because his wife told him to, not because of something in the government, but it's all about an 11-year-old girl who said, Mr. Lincoln, you sure would look better if you grew a beard. So I think that's really the fascinating story that kind of comes out of this is that Lincoln's mind was changed, or Lincoln was convinced by a young girl.
Yeah, and that young girl is, like you said, 11-year-old. Her name was Grace Bedell. And in October of 1860, elections in November, October of 1860, she wrote a letter to then candidate Abraham Lincoln, suggesting that he needed to grow a beard, some facial hair, because his face was too thin and a beard might improve his appearance. And Chris, it's interesting that he was getting pressure about this from other people as well. It wasn't just a young girl. There were some other political people saying, you look sort of gaunt. Maybe you need to grow some facial hair to cover that up. And it reminds me, Chris, something that Abraham Lincoln quipped about one time. And I think in some ways, in their ability to have these sort of comebacks, Reagan and Lincoln sort of remind me of each other. Somebody accused Abraham Lincoln one time of being two-faced. And he said something like, well, if I was two-faced, do you think I would have chosen this one? I mean, he had that sense of humor about himself. And I think some people, if this young lady had written to them, oh, you too skinny looking, you need to grow a beard, they might have been insulted, but he wasn't. He took it in good stride.
Well, and I think one of the other things is he didn't really have anybody to help guide him with this because he didn't have any daughters. And so, you have a young person who kind of writes to him and can help advise him on the matter. First of all, they don't mention beard. The terminology that is used is whiskers,
Mhm.
to grow these whiskers. And, you do mention the quips about Lincoln. Lincoln had been thinking something that could change his appearance, something that could be done different. And I did think it was interesting that he did say it is allowed to be ugly in this world, but not as ugly as I am. And so he thought that by growing these whiskers, it would hide what he determined to be his horrible lantern jaws. And it just goes to show that he was very mindful of his appearance. And we see this all throughout the presidency, that your looks can determine, especially when it comes to John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, that first televised debate. Many people still credit to this day that the reason that John F. Kennedy becomes president over Nixon is simply because for the first time the United States saw, the droopy jowls of Nixon versus the very young, athletic, handsome looking John F. Kennedy. And that did sway voters to select him over Nixon. So, Lincoln, here he is, doesn't have television, things of that nature, but he's finding a way in which people will not just hear him, but when they hear him and they see him, they'll think, yes, he's a presidential looking character. And if growing some whiskers helps, then he was all for it.
Yeah, and at this time, pictures, photographs were becoming much more common. So, it was more likely people were going to see him than George Washington. And, George Washington, the newspaper at the sides were just sort of these 1 to 2 page written documents. They didn't have any pictures of it. They didn't have any pictures, or sometimes they would have cartoons and things like that in them. But by the time you get to Lincoln, you're getting photographs. So people are seeing him in photos, people are seeing him in person. And she's like, man, I like you, but you look sick. You need some whiskers. And so he does. He grows it out, and he does in a letter to her in October 1960. He said that he had never had a beard, never had whiskers, but that he might actually grow it. And of course, as we know, he did.
Yeah, and I think what comes of this is it's also very fascinating how he's willing to make an effort to hear the voice of the people, if you will. But you got to remember, all of this is done through correspondence. And yet, what is also fascinating, he does these whistle stop tours,
Mhm.
campaigning for the presidency, things of that nature. And he decides, or somebody decides, that they will just happen to make a political campaign stop in the hometown of where Grace is residing. And that's an interesting story also of how not just through pen pals, but they have the encounter of coming face to face now that he's grown the whiskers.
Yeah, and they do come face to face, don't they?
And yeah, I think it's fascinating. So the train, they do these whistle stops or whatever, and the train pulls into to Westfield, and he's on the platform of the train giving a speech, and he then begins to tell the people, he says, there was this young girl that I developed a pen pal, kind of correspondence with, and she told me I needed to grow my whiskers and that it would improve my appearance. And then he said, and I did it, and now I'd like to see her if she's here. And so the people start saying, she's there, and they bring
Mhm.
Lincoln along with Grace together. And he actually gets off the platform, gets down to where the crowd of people are. He sees her, and the historical narrative says he gave her several hearty kisses. He was extremely grateful for her. And, he told everybody, you see, I let these whiskers grow for you, Grace. And I will say, you're always in awe when you meet a celebrity or if you meet somebody that is important or whatever, and you never forget those moments. But I can't imagine as an 11-year-old the president, the soon to be president of the United States, who is calling me out, addressing me, and then saying, I did this for you. I mean, wow, what a moment. And you can't make that stuff up. That is just a powerful story that I truly believe changed her life, but also I think it changed the course of the election because people saw Lincoln truly was a man of the people.
Yeah. And, I sort of think, wouldn't it have been nice if she had had, or her parents or whoever there was with her had had a iPhone or something, a Samsung, and they could have taken a video of this moment. I mean, that's one of those moments you want to relive over and over again. I mean, you get to, and that's what people do today. Of course, they meet a celebrity and they're not just taking pictures, they're taking videos. So, Chris, you mentioned
Well,
a minute ago, go
and
ahead.
I'm gonna go back because you said that, but also I think, and we teach at the college, and there's a course I teach about technology and society, about the rapid, movement of phones and things. And Ray, I will say, I'm thankful she didn't have an iPhone or anything like that because I think she would have missed the moment. Because I look at today, everybody is watching these big events. They're watching these encounters through the lens of their phone and not embracing the actual moment of the encounter. And so I'm thankful that it was a pure moment. It was an innocent moment. And you know what? I know Grace, and that's the only one that was really important, I guess, in that moment. She never forgot it. And that it relives because I still remember those moments when this something extraordinary has happened. And I remember it in my own memory, which is probably more powerful than a picture of it. And yes, it would have been nice, but I also think we've become too dependent on technology where we're looking at things through the lenses of technology instead of just appreciating the actual moment.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, you mentioned her meeting a celebrity, meeting the president of the United States. I'm going to ask you, who was the last celebrity or the biggest celebrity you've ever met?
Well, I mean, besides you,
I mean, that's obvious. We need to get beyond that though.
so
I
one
mean,
of the things,
after meeting me, it's going to go downhill, but
yeah,
we need to
I got two really quick like memories that I don't forget. One was when I was in high school and I played against Alonzo Mourning. And what I really remember about that is Alonzo Mourning dunked on me. And I remember being flat on my back in the paint and looking up, and basically him saying, Alonzo Mourning just dunked on you. Alonzo Mourning would go on and play for Georgetown. He went and played for the Miami Heat. He's a Hall of Famer in the NBA. He's extremely powerful. So I remember that. The other one I meant's more
not too
political.
flattering.
Not, you know what? I thought it was great. Dunk all over me. That's great. Wonderful. I can honestly say, it happened. Listen, I'm proud of it. And then the other one was, I remember meeting Senator Elizabeth Dole when she was thinking about presidency, thinking about all of those things. She was actually in Greensboro. And she walked right by me, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then I thought, oh my gosh, how much makeup does she have on her right now? That was the other thing that I still remember it to this day. I mean, it was just, she was a big fan of Mary Kay and bless her. But it was in that moment when you see people on TV, you're thinking, okay, I mean, but she had a lot of makeup on, and her husband was there. Uh, oh, Bob Dole, if you
Yeah, yeah.
remember them. So those are my two quick ones.
I remember in 1996, I was still in college and I thought Bob Dole had a chance. And was it one of my better moments?
Well, but you know what? Everybody at some point thought he had a chance. And it was, you know what? I think it probably was in 1996 when he was
Yeah,
campaigning. She was out
was.
there on the trail, helping him. But, I mean, but think about that. There's a lot of people who, up to the very end, thought Ross Perot had a chance,
Yep.
or, and some of these others. And so that's a whole other topic. Maybe if he'd grown a few whiskers, he might have had a chance.
You never know. He had the ears.
Yeah.
Uh, so Abraham Lincoln, he would grow this full mustache and beard to some, I guess it wasn't as full as some people's would be. But we haven't had a president with facial hair since William Howard Taft, who left the presidency in 1913. So it's been a long time since we've had a president who had facial hair. But right now, our Vice President J.D. Vance does.
Yeah. And if you think about it, imagine if, let's just go back to the Bill Clinton, George Bush, um, George H. Bush, and then Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. Just imagine them. I mean, I'm sure that AI could do that now, put them with beards on, but I think it would just mess us up so
Mm.
much if one of them was to come out with a beard. It would
Yeah.
just throw it off, right?
Well,
I
Al
mean,
Gore did it after the 2000, the years followed, he did. And it was like, who is that? That's Al Gore. Oh, really?
well, he was busy inventing the internet. So I mean,
Yeah.
he had a lot going on during that time that he couldn't keep up. But I wonder, okay, so let's take that for a step. You mentioned JD Vance, and in 2028, our listeners, they'll come back and remember this podcast and they'll think, I wonder if him having a beard will affect him in the tournament or affect the presidency. I wonder if that will affect the presidency.
That's interesting. That's an interesting idea. Will that be something that hurts his campaign if he decides to run in 2028? Or will it be something that will benefit him? I don't know. I mean, he's very young. How old is JD Vance?
Yeah,
He
and you're looking up the age, but I go back to, Abraham Lincoln. It truly makes a difference, especially when you see the pictures of him on the
yeah,
battlefield,
yeah.
standing with Grant and some of the other ones. And in all of these images, like he poses an intimidating presence. And I honestly do think in that situation, the whiskers did help. Um, and most Grant had more whiskers than Lincoln had, but there's power that goes in that. So I think it's different on the battlefield. You could also kind of go and look at Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's kind of a little bit more towards World War II and things of that nature. They didn't allow facial hair, didn't allow beards in the military and things of that, that aspect. But I do find it interesting that Lincoln commanded a presence, and a lot of that has to do with the hat, with the height. That beard made you stop and say, "Okay, there's something special about this man."
Yeah, JD Vance is 41. I was I was teaching the other day and I had the youngest people to ever become president on the board. And I mean, I had prepared this slide and everything in advance, but it didn't strike me until I was standing there going through it that I'm older than every single one of them. And I, it was quite a moment.
Well, but I mean, you're still younger than the current president
Well, yeah, this is true.
and the one before that.
That's true. And the one before that, and the
Yeah.
one before that.
So
So
see, I mean, there's
doing
still
all
hope for
right,
you.
man.
Remember, the Constitution doesn't have a age expiration on it. It just has a age, where you can begin. So I mean, you're right actually in the wheelhouse if you think about the Constitution. This is
It's
the moment
35,
for
right?
you. Yeah,
It's 35.
35. So
Yeah.
you're in the wheelhouse right now to where you could make your stand as, here I am. I've got enough wisdom and enough mature. Well, okay, I'll stop.
I was about to say a lot of people, if they'd hear me say that, they'd just start laughing and the campaign would be over. So
But you need a grace to come in your life and say, but Dr. Shepard, if you grew a few whiskers,
mm.
you know, I think it might help your appearance.
I've done that a little bit over the years, like, where I just didn't shave for a few days and got that sort of gruffy look, but I've stopped doing that. So, yeah, I got
Well, and people are probably wishing we would stop talking about that with this podcast too.
Yeah, yeah, probably. All right, Chris, great episode of the podcast History You Didn't Know But Should. We ask our listeners to share this episode with your family and friends. Be sure to give us a like on Facebook, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to us, YouTube, whatever. Make sure to give us a like and a positive comment, Chris.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, if anybody decides to travel to Washington D.C. and they go to the Library of Congress, they can actually put their hands on the actual letters, the correspondence
Yeah.
between Lincoln and Grace, and so that's a really cool history fact that you could go and what a great trivia if you walk into the Library of Congress and you say, "Tell me about the letters of Grace to Abraham Lincoln about growing beards." I tell you, that'll be a great conversation starter. It's the little things.
Yeah, and they say, "Where did you hear about it?" Well, I heard it on this podcast. Yeah.
History you didn't know but should. So, see,
Uh,
there you go. And as the world turns, it all comes back to the importance of studying and knowing your history, even the most random things.
Absolutely. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.